It was one of the harshest winter nights. The streets of New York were blanketed in snow, and the icy wind howled between the buildings. People wrapped their scarves tightly around their faces, rushing home to the warmth of their heated apartments. But that night, there was someone else, someone no one noticed. David, 55 years old, sat huddled in the corner of a building, his frail body wrapped in a tattered coat. Once he had been a respected teacher, passionate about mathematics, adored by his students, but life had been cruel. His wife had passed away after a long illness, and the grief consumed him. He lost his job, unable to focus, and soon, financial troubles followed. Bills piled up, his savings drained, and eventually, his home was taken away. The man who once inspired young minds now found himself struggling to survive on the unforgiving streets. That night felt different. He had no strength left to fight. His hands trembled, his stomach ached from hunger, and his body was growing numb. Maybe this is it, he thought. Maybe I'll just fall asleep here and never wake up. People walked past him, their eyes averted, pretending not to see. To them, he was invisible, until one man stepped out from the crowd and stopped right in front of him. Tom Hanks had just wrapped up a long day on set. Instead of heading straight to his car, he decided to take a quiet walk through the city. As he strolled through the bustling streets, something caught his eye. A man, shivering in the cold, tucked into the corner of a building. For a moment, Tom just stood there, watching. Countless people passed by without a second glance, but something about this man struck him. He had helped the homeless before, but this time it felt different. Slowly, he crouched down and spoke in a gentle voice. "Sir, are you all right?" David barely lifted his head. His eyes were hollow, his face weathered by the cruel passage of time. He wasn't used to kindness. People either ignored him or looked at him with disgust. But this man seemed different. Just a little cold, David whispered, his chapped lips barely moving. Without hesitation, Tom reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sandwich and a hot cup of coffee. "Please, take this," he said with a warm smile. David hesitated. Pride and hunger fought inside him, but the overpowering pain in his stomach won. His trembling hands wrapped around the warm cup, his body instinctively leaning into the comforting heat. Tom studied him closely. There was something about the way he carried himself, even in his current state, an air of someone who once stood tall. "Do I know you?" Tom asked, his curiosity piqued. David gave a weak shake of his head. "I don't think so. But once, a long time ago, many people knew me. I was a teacher." Those words struck something deep within Tom. Here, in the middle of a city filled with flashing lights and opportunity, was a man who had once shaped the future of young minds. Now forgotten, swallowed by time and misfortune. Tom Hanks sat down next to David, sensing the weight of exhaustion in his eyes. But it wasn't just physical fatigue. It was the heaviness of a soul carrying years of suffering. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The cold night wrapped around them, the silence of the street echoing their unspoken words. David clasped his trembling hands together, his fingers stiff from the cold. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he cleared his throat and began to speak. "A long time ago, I had a good life." He smiled faintly, but behind that smile lay shattered dreams. "I had a wonderful wife, a job I loved. I was a teacher. I taught math. Numbers always made sense to me. They never changed. They never let me down. But life isn't like that." Tom listened intently, his expression unreadable, but his heart aching. David's gaze drifted into the distance. "My wife, she was the best woman in the world. We had known each other since high school. She always told me, 'You inspire your students because you see the light in them.' But in the end, life took her from me." His voice cracked, his words breaking under the weight of years of grief. "Cancer. It was terminal, but we refused to believe it. We lied to ourselves, saying, 'Miracles happen, don't they?' I spent every dollar, drained every last bit of our savings to get her treatment. I worked harder, took on more debt, but in the end, she was gone, and I was left with nothing." Tom lowered his head slightly, words failing him. David stared at the ground, as if accepting a truth he had buried for too long. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You know, Tom, when she died, I did too." He inhaled deeply before continuing. "For days, I couldn't get out of bed. I forgot to eat. I didn't go to work. My students, my passion, none of it mattered anymore. The principal gave me time, but I never recovered. Then, I lost my job." Tom frowned. "Didn't anyone help you?" David let out a hollow laugh. "No one wants to witness an adult fall apart, Tom. People offer their condolences, but after a while, they move on. No one can carry someone else's grief for too long." Tom said nothing. He simply listened. Sometimes words weren't needed. David continued, his voice distant. "With no job, the bills piled up. I fell behind on rent. One day, after using the last bit of money, I had to leave flowers at my wife's grave. I came home to find my apartment locked. That was the day the streets became my home." He paused, took another deep breath, then turned to Tom. "Do you know what happens when people stop seeing you? You start forgetting yourself too. At first, you hold on for a week, maybe two. But then, there's no mirror to remind you who you are. The days blur together, and one morning, you wake up and realize you don't even remember your own face." Tom felt his chest tighten. He had never thought about homelessness like this before, not just as losing a roof over your head, but as losing yourself entirely. David shook his head, his voice hoarse. "The nights are the worst, Tom. The cold sinks into your bones, but it's the loneliness that freezes you. It's knowing that no one is looking for you, that no one is wondering where you are." Tom inhaled deeply, then asked gently, "Why didn't you ask for help?" David lifted his head, his tired eyes holding a flicker of something, perhaps defiance, perhaps hope. "Because once you fall, you stop believing that anyone will pick you up." Tom's eyes welled with tears. Anger, sadness, and disbelief swirled inside him. How could someone like David, a man who had once shaped young minds, a man who had given so much, be left to fade away, unseen and forgotten? But not anymore. Tom leaned closer, looking straight into David's eyes. "David, you are not forgotten, and I will not leave you here." David hadn't dared to believe in anything for a long time, but for the first time in years, he wanted to. That night, the hand Tom Hanks extended wasn't just offering help, it was offering a new beginning. Tom sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the man beside him. He had met many people in his life, but something about David struck him deeply. This man didn't just need food or shelter. He needed someone to remind him that he still mattered. "David," Tom finally said, his voice gentle yet firm, "you don't have to live like this. I want to help you." David looked up in surprise. "Help? Me?" Tom smiled warmly. "Yes, you. I'll do whatever it takes to help you get your life back." That night, Tom Hanks booked a hotel room for David. The man hesitated as he stepped inside, looking around as if he didn't belong there. A warm bed, clean clothes, a hot shower, things most people took for granted, were, to David, almost surreal. As he stood in front of the mirror after showering, he barely recognized himself. For the first time in years, he didn't look like a shadow of the man he used to be. He was still tired, still broken. But there was something different, a spark, a possibility. Over the next few days, Tom started making calls, determined to find a way to help David rebuild his life. With the help of some friends, he managed to track down records, confirming that David had once been a highly respected teacher. "If you still want to teach, I'll do everything I can to help you," Tom told him. David swallowed hard, overwhelmed. I don't know if I can. What if I fail?" Tom placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You already survived the hardest part. Now it's time to start again." Months passed. David was no longer sleeping on the streets. Thanks to Tom's efforts, he had secured a teaching position at a local school. Walking through the halls, hearing the chatter of students, seeing the curious eyes staring up at him, it all felt like a dream. One afternoon, a student solved a math problem on the board and turned to David with a beaming smile. "Mr. Thompson, you're the best teacher I've ever had." David's heart swelled. He had thought his life was over, that he had nothing left to offer. But now, standing in a classroom again, He realized he had been given something precious, a second chance. That evening, Tom Hanks visited him at the school. They sat outside on a bench, watching the last of the students leave for the day. Tom glanced over at him, grinning. "So how's your second chance going?" David exhaled, shaking his head with a smile. "Sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you to change your entire life." Tom nodded, looking up at the stars. "And now, it's your turn to pass it on." That night, for the first time in years, David felt whole again. Because someone had reached out, because someone had seen him, not as a lost cause, but as a man worth saving.